Ever get that feeling like you want to really wrap your head around something complicated, but like the thought of digging through mountains of articles and books is just too much?
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Well, that's where we come in. This is the deep dive, your fast track to becoming seriously informed. We sort of do the heavy lifting so you don't have to, bringing you just the most interesting and crucial bits.
Kind of like a cheat sheet to understanding.
Exactly.
I like that.
And today you've sent us toward a pretty intriguing subject, anabolic steroids.
Oh, yeah, this is going to be a good one. We're going deep into the book Anabolics 2005 by Llewellyn. And let me tell you, this is like the ultimate guide, going way beyond just the surface stuff to really cover the properties, effects, and even practical applications.
We're talking real-world stuff as it's written in the text.
Absolutely.
So your mission, if you choose to accept it, and let's be honest, by listening you already have, is to come away from this with a solid understanding of the core concepts, but without getting lost in all the tiny details.
We're going to give you the need to know, basically.
Exactly. And trust me, there are some genuinely surprising and important things to unpack here.
We might even bust a few myths along the way, who knows?
Oh, I'm sure we will.
So to keep us on track, we'll kick things off by taking a look at the fundamental ways these steroids work within the body.
The nuts and bolts.
Yeah. From there, we'll explore some specific types of anabolic steroids and what makes each of them unique. And finally, we'll tackle some of the bigger considerations like those pesky side effects and the fact that the market is kind of like the Wild West, lots of counterfeits out there.
We'll give you the lay of the land so you can navigate it safely.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's get right into it. Anabolic steroids. At their most basic, you've got to understand that these are synthetic versions of the male hormone testosterone.
Man-made, basically.
Yep. And testosterone, as you probably know, is essential for, well, normal male development, everything that goes with it. But these lab-created versions, well, they're designed to really crank up the anabolic processes in the body. We're talking about some serious muscle growth here.
Yeah, that's the main draw for a lot of people.
Right. But they also have androgenic effects, which are those more masculine traits. It's a two-for-one deal, in a way.
It's important to remember that, though, they affect more than just your muscles. It's like a whole body thing.
Absolutely. It's not just about getting swole. Now, the book delves into how testosterone actually works its magic at the cellular level, and it's pretty fascinating.
Oh, it is. So once testosterone enters your bloodstream, it can actually sneak right into your cells and interact with these specific receptors.
Like tiny little doorways.
Exactly. And this interaction is like a key fitting into a lock, and it directly influences the cell's DNA, which ultimately controls protein synthesis. This is the fundamental mechanism by which testosterone and, by extension, anabolic steroids can have such a dramatic impact on muscle tissue growth and a whole range of other bodily functions. It's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it.
It really is. It's like this cascade of events all triggered by this one little hormone.
Yep. It's a chain reaction.
Now, the book makes a distinction between direct and indirect anabolic effects, which is interesting. Let's break that down a bit.
Sure. So the most direct effect, as you mentioned, is through this binding of the steroid to those androgen receptors within muscle cells.
Like flipping a switch.
Exactly. When this happens, it triggers a whole cascade of events within the cell, signaling it to start producing more proteins, which ultimately leads to bigger muscle fibers, a process called hypertrophy. This is essentially the main highway for muscle growth driven by these compounds.
The express lane to gain.
Exactly. But then there are these indirect effects that the book talks about, which are a little more mysterious.
The back roads, you might say.
Yeah, exactly. So the source suggests that anabolic steroids might also influence muscle growth through other pathways, although it does acknowledge that we need more research to fully understand how these indirect mechanisms work.
Always more research needed.
Always. But, for example, they might mess with the levels of other hormones involved in growth and metabolism, like growth hormone and insulin-like growth factor 1, or IGF-1 for short. These hormones have complex roles in the body, and steroids could potentially be tweaking their effects.
Throwing a wrench in the works, so to speak.
That's a good way to put it. The text also briefly touches on glucocorticoids, which are hormones that actually do the opposite of what we want. They promote muscle breakdown.
Oh no, our games.
Right. So anabolic steroids, in a way, work against their catabolic effects, trying to keep that muscle breakdown in check. And then there's creatine, which is a popular supplement for athletes, but it works in a totally different way. It helps with muscle energy and performance, but it's not directly messing with your hormones like steroids do.
So it's like a multi-pronged attack on muscle growth.
Exactly.
Now, another thing the book dives into is free versus bound testosterone.
This is a big one.
Yeah, it seems pretty crucial when we're talking about anabolic steroids. Why is this distinction so important?
Okay, so picture this. You've got a certain amount of testosterone floating around in your blood, right?
Doing its thing.
Right. But the thing is, most of it isn't actually free to do its thing. It's bound to proteins, mainly this one called sex hormone binding globulin, or SHBG.
Kind of like handcuffs.
Yeah, perfect analogy. So only a small fraction of the testosterone is actually unbound or free. And that's the biologically active part that can interact with those receptors we were talking about and actually influence your body's functions. And here's where it gets really interesting and relevant to steroid use. When you introduce synthetic anabolic steroids into the mix, they can actually change the levels of SHBG, which in turn affects how much free active testosterone you have floating around. So even if a blood test shows your total testosterone levels are within a normal range, the amount that's actually available for your body to use can be totally different depending on your SHBG levels.
So it's not just about the total amount, it's about how much of it is actually ready to work.
Exactly.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, let's talk about a term that gets thrown around a lot in the world of steroids.
Yeah.
Estrogen aromatization. What exactly is going on here, and why should people be aware of it?
Okay, so this is all about a metabolic pathway that can lead to some pretty undesirable side effects, especially for guys. Your body has this enzyme called aromatase, and this enzyme's job is to convert some of your testosterone into estrogen.
Isn't estrogen a female hormone?
It is, but men have it too, just in smaller amounts. It's all about balance. But here's the thing. When you start pumping your body full of extra testosterone, either naturally or through steroids, this aromatase enzyme goes into overdrive, and you can end up with higher estrogen levels than you want.
Not good.
Not good at all, especially for men. Increased estrogen can lead to all sorts of problems, most notably gynecomastia, which is basically the development of breast tissue in men. Not exactly the look most guys are going for. And here's another important thing to note. Different anabolic steroids have different tendencies to aromatize. Some convert to estrogen more easily than others.
So choosing the right steroid could minimize that risk.
Exactly. You got to be strategic.
Now, similar to estrogen aromatization, there's also DHT conversion to consider. What's the deal with dihydrotestosterone, or DHT?
So just like testosterone can be converted to estrogen, it can also be converted into another hormone called dihydrotestosterone, or DHT for short. This conversion is carried out by a different enzyme called 5-alpha reductase. Now, DHT is actually a more potent androgen than testosterone itself, meaning it has a stronger effect on those masculinizing characteristics we were talking about earlier.
So more manliness, essentially.
Yeah, you could say that. DHT plays a role in things like hair growth, prostate health, and even contributes to some of the anabolic effects.
Sounds like a mixed bag.
It is, because just like with elevated estrogen, too much DHT can also lead to some unwanted side effects. This includes things like accelerated hair loss, male pattern baldness, and also prostate enlargement. It's all about finding that sweet spot.
A delicate balance, for sure. So we're seeing how introducing these synthetic hormones can really throw things out of whack. Now, the book gives us a bit of a history lesson with a brief history of anabolic androgenic steroids. What are some of the key moments in their development?
Well, the real serious study and synthesis of these compounds didn't really take off until the early 20th century. And initially, it wasn't about building muscle at all. The focus was mainly on medical applications, like treating hormone deficiencies and things like that.
Interesting. So it wasn't always about gains?
Nope. But as researchers dug deeper, they started to realize just how potent testosterone and its synthetic cousins were at building muscle, and naturally that sparked a whole lot of interest in exploring their potential for, shall we say, less medical uses.
The allure of the swole was too strong to resist.
Exactly.
And that brings us to synthetic HS development. How did scientists go about creating all these different types of anabolic steroids from the basic testosterone molecule? Seems like there's a whole pharmacy out there.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. So scientists started tinkering with the basic testosterone molecule, making tiny changes here and there to create a whole array of synthetic anabolic steroids. These modifications were carefully designed to change specific properties of the hormone, like how well it's absorbed by the body, how quickly it's broken down, how strongly it binds to those androgen receptors, and even how likely it is to convert to estrogen or DHT.
So they were basically custom designing steroids for different purposes.
Exactly. Like, one common modification is adding an alkyl group usually at the 17th carbon atom, a process called alkylation, which helps the steroid survive being broken down by the liver when you take it orally. That's how you get oral steroids. But the trade-off is it can put more stress on your liver.
There's always a trade-off.
Always. They also played around with adding double bonds, like in Boldenone, or tweaking the Nandrolone molecule. Each of these little tweaks changes how the steroid behaves in the body. And the book even has this diagram of the sterin nucleus, which is like the basic skeleton that all steroid hormones are built on. It's pretty cool, actually.
Yeah.
It's like chemistry meets bodybuilding.
Right.
And then there's the whole world of steroid nomenclature. It sounds like you need a PhD to understand how these things are named.
It can be a bit intimidating at first glance, I'll admit. But there's actually a system to the madness. The prefixes and suffixes they use often tell you something about the structural changes they've made to the basic testosterone molecule. For example, the prefix oxy usually means they've added an oxygen group, and suffixes like ol generally mean the compound is a steroid alcohol, meaning it has a hydroxyl group, which is just an oxygen and hydrogen atom bonded together. And the suffix ome often means there's a double bond somewhere in the molecule.
So it's like a code you can crack.
Exactly. The book has a table of common commercial names, too, with examples like boldenone, ethylestrenol, floxymesterone, and if you pay close attention, you can actually see how the names relate back to the chemical structure. Once you learn a few of these basic naming rules, you can start to figure out some of the steroid's properties just from its name. Pretty neat, huh? Yeah, that's actually pretty cool. It's like a secret language for gym bros. Okay, so we've got a good grasp of how these things work and where they come from. But now let's talk about the elephant in the room, steroid side effects. This is something everyone wants to know about.
Absolutely. And while the focus might be on getting bigger muscles and better performance, it's super important to understand that the source material goes into great detail about the potential side effects, and they can affect pretty much every system in your body. We're not just talking about superficial changes here.
It's not just about acne and hair loss, right?
Right. Although those are possibilities too. But we're talking about some potentially serious stuff.
Like what?
Well, for starters, there's the cardiovascular risks, which are often overlooked by people who are just focused on the aesthetic side of things. We're talking about things like changes in cholesterol levels, usually a drop in the good kind and a spike in the bad kind.
Not good for the ticker.
Nope. And high blood pressure or hypertension is another concern. Llewellyn really goes in depth on the mechanisms behind these cardiovascular risks in the book.
That's scary stuff.
It can be. Then there are the psychological effects, which are often downplayed. Things like increased aggression, sometimes called roid rage, which is a bit of a cliche, but definitely a real thing. And also depression and other mood swings. It can really mess with your mental state.
It's not just about the physical.
Right. And of course, there are the hormonal imbalances, which can lead to all sorts of problems. Gynecomastia in men, which is when they develop breast tissue.
That's a common one you hear about.
Yeah, and it's not just cosmetic, it can be psychologically damaging too. And then in women, you can get virilization, which is the development of male characteristics.
Like deepening of the voice and stuff?
Exactly. Hair growth in unusual places too.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's sexual dysfunction and testicular atrophy, which are common concerns for men. Basically, your body's natural hormone production can get thrown out of whack when you're taking steroids.
It's like messing with a finely tuned machine.
Exactly. And your liver and kidneys take a hit too because they have to work harder to process all these foreign substances.
A whole body stress test.
You could say that. And then there are the rare but more serious side effects like anaphylactic shock, which is a severe allergic reaction.
That's life-threatening, right?
It can be, yeah. And then if a woman is pregnant and using steroids, it can cause birth defects.
Definitely not something to mess around with.
No, not at all. And there's also the potential for changes in blood clotting, which can increase the risk of strokes and other problems. And some studies suggest a possible long-term increased risk of certain cancers.
That's a long list of potential problems.
It is. And we also have to remember that steroids can stunt growth in teenagers whose bones haven't finished growing yet. And they can cause fluid and salt retention, which can make you look bloated.
So it's not all sunshine and roses, that's for sure. But I think it's important to emphasize that not everyone who uses steroids is going to experience all of these side effects.
Yeah, absolutely. The severity and the likelihood of experiencing side effects varies wildly from person to person.
What are some of the factors that play a role?
Well, it depends on things like the specific steroid you're using, obviously. Some are more potent than others. And the dosage plays a huge role too. The higher the dose, the greater the risk. And then there's how long you're using them for. The longer the cycle, the more time your body is exposed to these substances and the greater the potential for harm.
So it's about minimizing the risks.
As much as possible, yes. And then there are individual factors too, like your genetics, your overall health, and even your lifestyle choices. What might be fine for one person could be disastrous for another. It's not a one-size-fits-all thing.
It sounds like there are a lot of variables to consider.
There are, and that's why it's so important to do your research and understand the risks before even thinking about using these substances.
Knowledge is power, as they say. Okay, now let's move into the realm of practical application, which is where things get really interesting. The book has a section on sample steroid stacks. What are those all about?
So these are examples of what people in the bodybuilding world call steroid cycles, or stacks. It's basically combining different anabolic steroids, often with the goal of maximizing muscle growth while trying to minimize side effects. Although, to be clear, there's no guarantee that stacking will actually reduce the risks.
It's like a chemical cocktail.
In a way, yes. And I have to emphasize here that these examples are presented purely for informational purposes as they appear in the book. We're not endorsing or recommending these stacks in any way. Using these substances carries serious health risks, and we would never advise anyone to try these without proper medical supervision.
We're just reporting on what's in the book, folks. Don't try this at home.
Exactly.
So what are some of the examples the book gives?
Well, one is called the Deca-Durabolin mass builder stack. This one combines methandionone, which is also known as Dianabol, taken as oral tablets, with Deca-Durabolin, which is nandrolone decanoate, and that's an injectable steroid. The suggested cycle is 10 weeks long, with specific weekly doses outlined for each compound. Another example is the non-toxic oral lean mass cycle stack, which combines andriol, an oral form of testosterone undecanoate, which comes in capsules, with primo tabs, which are methanolone acetate. This cycle is shorter, only 7 weeks, and it focuses on oral administration, probably to avoid needles. And then there's the Proviron Deca Winstrol cutting lean mass cycle stack, which combines Proviron tablets, Deca injections, and Winstrol, also known as stanozolol, in tablet form. This one has varying weekly doses over an 11-week period.
It's a lot to keep track of.
It is, and it just goes to show how complex these steroid regimens can get.
And again, it's important to remember that these are just examples, not recommendations. Don't try to recreate these stacks without professional medical guidance. You can seriously harm yourself.
Agree.
Now, one of the most eye-opening parts of the book for me was the section on steroid lab test results and counterfeit concerns. This really highlights just how shady and dangerous the steroid market can be.
Yeah, that was a real wake-up call for a lot of people. The book includes the results of lab analyses of various commercially available anabolic steroid products.
So they actually tested these products.
They did. And what they found was pretty shocking. In many cases, the actual amount of steroid in the product didn't match what the label said. Sometimes it was significantly less. Sometimes it was a different substance altogether.
So you could be taking something completely different from what you think you're taking.
Exactly. It's a huge problem, and it really highlights the dangers of buying steroids on the black market. You just never know what you're getting.
So it's not just about the risks of steroids themselves. It's about the risks of getting a fake or contaminated product.
Exactly. It's like a double whammy.
Can you give us some specific examples of these discrepancies from the lab tests?
Sure. For oxandrolone, which is better known as Anavar, they found cases where the actual amount of the steroid per tablet was way off from what the label claimed. And this was true for products from different manufacturers like SPA Milano, British Dragon, and generic supplements. And even different batches from the same manufacturer could have different amounts.
So there's no consistency.
None whatsoever. And for Dianabol or methandrostinolone, they found similar problems. The actual steroid content varied a lot from the labeled dose across different brands and batches, including brands like Medivet QV, Deboldencol, Reforvit Simple, Dianabol Injtab Solud, Bioreactor, and generic supplements.
So basically it's a gamble every time you buy a product.
Pretty much. And the book goes on to list similar findings for a whole bunch of other steroids, like Equipoise, Masteron, Primobolan Depot, Sustanon 250, various forms of testosterone like Cypionate, Enanthate, and Propionate, and even Trenbolone acetate.
It's like the Wild West of pharmaceuticals.
Exactly. Buyer beware.
Now, the book also mentions something called paper steroids. What are those?
So these are basically steroids that are printed onto little pieces of paper, kind of like those breath strips you used to get.
So you absorb them through your mouth.
Yeah, you put them under your tongue or between your cheek and gum, and the steroid gets absorbed directly into your bloodstream.
That's pretty ingenious, actually.
It is, and it's very discreet, which is probably why they're so popular on the black market.
Easier to smuggle, I guess.
Right.
So speaking of the black market, let's talk about underground manufacturers and counterfeit steroids. It sounds like a minefield out there.
It is. Because there are so many unregulated manufacturers operating in the shadows, there's really no way to know for sure what's in the products they're making. They could be underdosed, contaminated, or even completely fake.
Scary stuff.
It is. You could think you're taking testosterone, but you could actually be injecting yourself with something completely different.
So are there any red flags people can look out for to try to spot a fake? The book mentions a few, right?
It does. One thing to look out for is matching labels on different products. If you see a bunch of different steroids, all claiming to be from the same manufacturer, and they all have the exact same label, that's a pretty good sign that something's fishy.
Like they just printed a bunch of generic labels.
Exactly. And then pay attention to the ampules or vials the injectables come in. If they look weird, like the glass is different quality or the fill levels are inconsistent, that could be a warning sign. Same thing with pill bottles. If they look cheap or unprofessional, be wary.
So it's all about attention to detail.
It is, and even little things like the expiration date can be a giveaway. If it looks like it's been tampered with, or if the label isn't glossy when it should be, that could be a sign that it's a fake. Some legitimate manufacturers use security stickers to try to combat counterfeiting.
Like those holograms you see on some products.
Yeah, similar to that. The book mentions Greek pharmacies and manufacturers in Mexico and Thailand that use them, but even those can be copied, so they're not foolproof.
So it's really tough to know for sure.
It is. The bottom line is if you're going to buy steroids on the black market, you're taking a huge risk. You just never know what you're getting.
And the consequences could be serious.
Absolutely.
Now, finally, let's touch on the legal side of things with anabolic steroids and the law.
Okay.
What's the general legal status of these substances?
Well, in most countries, including the U.S., anabolic steroids are controlled substances.
Meaning they're illegal to possess or sell without a prescription.
Exactly. In the U.S., they're classified as Schedule III drugs under the Anabolic Steroid Control Act of 2004. This means they have a recognized medical use, but they also have a high potential for abuse.
So doctors can prescribe them for legitimate medical reasons.
Yes, but it's tightly controlled. And the penalties for possessing or selling them illegally can be pretty stiff.
Jail time and fines.
Yep. And the laws can vary from country to country, so it's important to know the rules wherever you are.
Don't get caught on the wrong side of the law. So to sum up, this deep dive into Anabolics 2005 has really shown us just how complex these substances are. They're not just about building muscle. They can affect your whole body in profound ways.
Right. And the risks are real.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the market is full of shady characters and counterfeit products, so buyer beware.
Definitely.
So here's a thought to leave you with. Given all the complexities and risks associated with anabolic steroids, what are the broader societal implications of their use, especially in the context of performance enhancement and body image?
That's a good question.
Yeah. What does it say about our culture that so many people are willing to risk their health to achieve a certain physical ideal? And where do we draw the line between acceptable and unacceptable methods of performance enhancement?
It's something to think about.
It is. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
My pleasure.
We'll see you next time.